Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome the British statesman and senior Conservative politician, Sir Iain Duncan Smith. Sir Iain has served as leader of the Conservative Party as well as Secretary of State for Work and Pension. A long-standing critic of the European Union, Sir Iain is also the chairman of the Centre for Social Justice. Sir Iain, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, Sir Iain, before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion, I'd like to take the opportunity to wish you and your family well during this unprecedented crisis. Can I begin by asking, how has the coronavirus crisis personally impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, actually, in a personal sense, it hasn't really impacted dramatically other than travelling. But in constituency terms, as an MP, it's absolutely certain we're dealing with much more than we might normally deal with. I would think, 200, 300 cases a week is quite normal at the moment. Businesses, self-employed people concerned, not understanding what to do, chasing up on lots of things that are going on. And I think I wouldn't be alone in saying that most others are facing the same massive increase. It's beginning to tail off as people now understand where they are. But in the first few weeks, it was really significant. And we were the kind of go-to when you couldn't figure it out. You contact the MP. I also did a lot of tours of the constituency, talking to businesses, highlighting their position where businesses were open, in a way advertising that, interviewing people who are running their businesses so they could explain why they're still open, what they do, how they would manage it in these circumstances. One garage I went to visit, actually, just purely because I was going past it and I suddenly noticed he was tucked away in the back. So I went and chatted to him, and we had a good conversation. I posted that thinking, that would just be of interest. I think it ended up on Facebook, which is quite, it isn't quite the same as Twitter. But Facebook, I think there were over 6,000, nearly 7,000 people engaged on that. And they'd only be people living locally. So it had very big pickup and even higher levels of people passing it on. So I take from that people were very interested in what was going on in their local community, particularly when it came to shops, food, those sort of things. So yeah, that bit. And on the wider front, things like China, concerns around China, the Brexit issue, getting out of lockdown, these you continue, but writing articles, doing interviews like this, you can do that quite a lot from home. I mean, I don't think anybody knew what Zoom was before we went into the lockdown. Now everybody does, and going to all sorts of other sophisticated systems which no one's ever heard of. So yeah, and that's how the impact worked.
I mean, you mentioned lockdown, China and Brexit, and we will touch on all of those. So sticking with the virus, Sir Iain, how would you assess the government's handling of the crisis so far compared to other Western countries?
Well, I think the government's handling has been very similar to most Western countries. They face the same problems. They've faced the same difficulties in trying to overcome those problems. And their successes have very much mirrored those elsewhere. Lessons seem to have been learned. I think, therefore, the government has handled it pretty well. Have they made mistakes? Yes, they have admitted that, and I think they will go on admitting that there have been things they might, in hindsight, have done differently. But we were dealing and have been dealing with an unprecedented pandemic. And therefore, getting it right from the very outset was an almost impossible task. And comparisons directly with other countries don't always work because populations are different. So you get a better view about our performance when you extrapolate for population. So that means pretty much, if you look at that figure, the UK, although the media loves to go on about how the UK is in the highest bracket, has more deaths, etc., than other countries. But then when you look at the population, then you get a different feature, which is we're right in the middle of the pack, really. Countries like Belgium are right at the top with per capita population deaths very high. And the other bit also that doesn't quite work, the UK has a very peculiar situation insofar as a huge chunk of its population is centered dramatically in London and the southeast. Yeah. And that concentration leads to two things. One, a much quicker spread of the virus than in many other countries. And secondly, a reality that controlling that takes slightly longer. And so it's different from, say, Spain or even Italy, where you don't get this vast concentration, you get much more spread out. So these sort of differences are difficult to map, but we will look back and extrapolate evidence from places like Sweden that didn't lock down and see whether or not it was remarkably different. And so far, I don't think it is.
Now, speaking of lockdowns, Iain, how would you assess the government's handling of the lockdown so far, and the continuation where we are now in terms of the potential economic implications, for instance?
Well, I have been arguing for now nearly 5 weeks that we needed to start letting the British public know that we had to come out of lockdown and that work was vital to get the economy moving. And getting the economy moving, and I was sorry that this had been allowed to get legs. It shouldn't have been. The sense that we had a choice between saving an economy or saving lives, this is a completely false choice. The reality is that both are about saving lives. The economy is about saving lives. If we don't get our economy growing again and growing reasonably quickly, then you will see an upsurge of deaths in other reasons, for other reasons, and this is down to the fact that, being unemployed without much prospect is a depressing experience. And also, there are real issues about funding. We need an economy to grow to fund all of our requirements, particularly with the NHS, etc. So there is no differential between lives and the economy. The two are intertwined, and that's the most important bit. But I've been arguing with some economists that we needed to get the economy moving pretty quickly, really, because coming out of this was going to be more difficult than going in, and it required preparation time. Now, the government at that stage didn't agree with me, and so they said they weren't going to change their messaging. But just under 2 weeks ago, they decided finally to change their messaging, and the result is that they're now talking about coming out of lockdown. But it's going to take a little while to get people into the mindset that allows them to go back to work without the fear and without the worry. And I think that's the critical bit, getting people back onto the real sense of that life is a balance of risks, and here is the balance that you see, and here's how to avoid some of the risks.
And of course, the fact is all countries practically all countries are in the same position. And of course, until other countries start to see improvements in other countries. I mean, we hear, for example, that New Zealand, for one, is doing relatively well. But of course, if New Zealand's trading partners are still in the tank, if their economies are in the tank, then New Zealand is going to face problems. And that's true of every country. The world is the interconnected spider web, the world economy, certainly. In terms of the consequences, we'll talk about the global implications in a second. But sticking with the domestic, do you think the crisis and the lockdown is likely to throw the government's agenda out of the window?
Well, that is the unanswered question, and the one that really is going to come bearing down on us like an express train. The reality is, I'm afraid, is that the UK economy is going to take a very significant hit. We're not alone in this. The French, the Italians, the Germans, all of them will take a hit. The question for us is, how do we deal with the extensive borrowing and also with the need to get the economy functioning quickly? So this is really the critical issue. And then where are we after that? Because the government does have this strong view, and I absolutely support it, that we need now to try and redistribute the nature of how the UK economy works. I mean, I head up the Centre for Social Justice, and we did a report on does the UK have a productivity problem? And the issue we dealt with, first of all, is measuring productivity. It's a very poor measure, and I think the OECD now needs to seriously look at it, because it's okay for measuring manufacturers, how many widgets did you make this week and how many did you make last week? It's no good, really. It's very difficult to measure the output in terms of services, financial services, etc. And as the UK economy is probably more dependent now on services than most other economies, this is really important. So the first thing is, I don't think the measure helps in measuring UK productivity. But what we did find using the measure was that the UK as a whole does not have a productivity problem. The problem is relevant to the point I was making earlier about the nature of where the economy sits in the UK. And I give you the example of the results. We found that the London and the Southeast actually have the highest productivity pretty much of any region in Europe. Once you move out of London and the Southeast, intriguingly, not one single region of the UK reaches the average for the UK in productivity. So you can see by how much the spike of London and the Southeast productivity carries the UK. So this is clearly then the problem. The problem is we do not have a better distributed economy around the UK, which has led to very poor productivity in many of these areas. So we need to affect that, and that's really very much what the government's agenda is, particularly coming out of the election in December. And therefore, that means looking very carefully at how can you move some of this this productive industry, as it were, both in services and in many cases manufacture, into these regions. What do you require for that to take place naturally? And that, of course, means much better communication links in the sense that speeds of Wi-Fi, etc., need to be much faster. But at the same time, you need better rail and road links, not vast, great projects, what I often refer to as projects that are coming out of central government, almost vanity projects. What we do need is a lot of money spent on things like bypasses, rail links between cities in the north and in the Midlands. All of these things need to come through in an accelerated state, and these are much easier to do than vast, great projects. And the third area, I think, is looking very, very carefully at the nature of what we have let go from the UK and whether or not we can bring some of that process back. And I was looking the other day, for example, at electricity generation. Now, there's a big debate about how we generate electricity going further down the road. But one of the areas that's gone completely missing is when we look at the need for nuclear, and there's been a big case made for nuclear, it's a very expensive form of electricity. And the nuclear power plants themselves do not last a vast period of time. So that payback has to come over a shorter period. But yet we do in the UK as an island possess something really quite peculiarly helpful, and that is tidal flows. On the west coast of the UK, we have some of the best areas for using tidal power. Now, why is that important? Well, they're building this at the moment in Swansea. And I think it's Swansea anyway. The main point I make is that these tidal lagoons that they produce, they can produce a significant amount of energy. And the interesting point about it is, unlike wind power, these you can set your clock by when they're generating. So twice a day, over a period of time, they will generate. This is important not just because it can produce up to 30 or 40% of our electricity needs for the UK, but more importantly, almost all of this can be produced in the UK, giving us a real shot in the arm in terms of something we can sell around the world, plus also bring skills back into the UK. Shipyards, which are often in poor areas, that could be reinstated, building the machinery for this. You've got all sorts of areas of steel making that would have to come back in, that reinvigorates it. So the plan could be to bring these sort of skills back in on the back of what we call new technologies. And that means that I think we need to have that balance. And the final point I'd make about this, and this brings in the China issue, I just don't think, if the question is how do we get to better power sources that do not damage the environment, I think batteries are simply not the answer. Batteries are vast, great things, particularly for buses and stuff, and there's no recycling that takes place. Pretty much they have to be dumped into landfill. So whilst it seems clean to generate electricity via batteries, actually, in truth, you're not doing the environment a big favor. What we should be looking at, again, Britain has a world lead in hydrogen development and hydrogen power. We should be using that. We should be talking about how we develop that. One of the buses companies in Northern Ireland is now going over to hydrogen power. So all these sort of things are where we have to be as we go forward. It's not just about infrastructure. It's about making sure the decisions we take have strategic value to the UK in terms of regenerating and renovating whole areas that have got left behind and have now, full of people that simply don't think they have the same opportunities as they do in the southeast, and that we can change that.
It's interesting you mentioned some of these potential positive changes. I mean, you mentioned Zoom earlier, and of course, study after study has shown that home working can make people more productive. It looks as if this may be a permanent change. And of course, you touched upon Britain's lead in certain sectors. Britain has a superstar higher education sector, possibly the only one that can seriously compete with the best universities in the United States. clearly you think there can be some positive changes. So speak a little bit more about that. What positive economic changes could we see? Could this perhaps catalyze a new economic renaissance? Could Britain get ahead in some of the growth technologies of the next century because of what has happened?
Yes, I do. I'm an optimist about the UK. I was certainly an optimist before coronavirus hit us. But I still remain an optimist, providing we get the right decisions. The truth is, I think the UK is bristling with talent. And for too long, we've followed I think, a peculiar path, which is to say that the global market is all, and there's nothing you can do about it. Truth is, some sections of the global market actually distort what is a normal and proper free market. And we do need to challenge the idea that you have to be in Silicon Valley to set up a smart software-based company. That is simply not true, and we can do a lot of this. I mean, the computer games industry is a classic example. We have an incredibly successful market here in the games industry, and the UK has companies now that lead the world in this. So we need to learn from that. They didn't all depart for Silicon Valley, and now as a result, Britain is probably a world leader in producing computer games. And I think this is an important point. We don't need to accept the fact the world needs to be dominated by the Amazons of this world, and the Facebooks and all the rest of it. We need to be able to challenge that here, and therefore government needs to be looking at how these areas of new advancement and new technology, I say incentivized, but can be supported in the early days of setting up. And they don't have to be set up in London too. That's the other beauty of this. These sort of industries can be set up in other places. These are real opportunities for, the Manchesters of this world and the Newcastles and Carlisles to be able to suddenly produce opportunities for companies to set up, to build businesses. To do that, we do need, however, the government to lay proper infrastructure links. That's the number one thing. Free up these towns and cities to work together to create other bases other than London that have the capacity to be global international businesses. And we also need to take a strategic view about what we think is important and vital to the UK in terms of what we do. You're right about our universities. Our universities are hugely involved already in industry. So most of industry goes to British universities and to work with them to develop new programs and new concepts. And in that, they are world leaders, because in America, this is done in a more specialist way. It isn't necessarily the universities that do this. And that's why Cambridge, for example, has brought in a huge amount of money from places like Microsoft and others, because they're already centers of excellence. And now that means that other money will come in because they can do things which other universities can't do. So we need to take stock, almost like a new doomsday book of what we actually have, what we can do, and how we build on that capacity. And that's where the government has to go on this. It isn't all about building long railways. It's mostly about building capability and giving people opportunity.
I hear that. And apart from laying the ground with infrastructure links, is there any other way in which the government could potentially support this technological renaissance?
Well, very much in questioning again some of the stuff that we've allowed to go elsewhere. I think fascinatingly, when you look at the recent argument over the 5G development, and we're looking beyond 5G to 6G, we're stuck in this debate about Huawei and whether they should be involved. I think there's absolutely no question that a company like Huawei should never be anywhere near our communications industry. And I think they pose a particular threat. But more than that, I also think the way that we've behaved with China has simply gone beyond common sense. The free market is one of the great tools of the world, introduced by a Scotsman. The concept of free trade is really important. And the free market is designed to give everybody an equal shot at producing and selling goods and services. The problem is it only works whilst countries themselves obey rules. So there are rules about how the market works. That's why the WTO was set up. When you get a country like China that basically is a very authoritarian regime, that brooks no dissent, that does not enjoy a concept of human rights, that has a very bad record of internal suppression, and has behaved in a way that is both strategic and at the same time undercutting and undermining the idea of a market being a fair marketplace, then you get massive distortions. And in that, you can see that the strategic determination of the Chinese government to dominate the communication systems market has meant that we've gone from about 11 or 12 companies that could build systems like 2G and 3G now down to 3 non-Chinese companies in the world that are capable of doing this: Ericsson, Nokia, and in Korea, South Korea, Samsung. No companies in America. Why? Because they've all been driven out of business by the Huawei way of doing business, which is to basically undercut, underprice, and dump the market. Which means basically, if you're a normal company operating in a normal free market environment, you require to sell goods to make profit, to reinvest that, to develop your industry. If you're not making any profits and you can't, every time you bid, you're undercut because you simply can't go below cost, then the answer is you shut your shop up, which is exactly what's been happening. So we are teetering now on the brink of having no companies involved in this, leaving the field completely clear for the Chinese. This was a strategic decision by the Chinese battery manufacturer in advance of the need for electrical powered vehicles. China is the single biggest dominant producer of batteries in the world. Who makes our telephones? Well, this thing that I'm talking on at the moment, made in China. Computers that you're probably sitting in front of, made in China, almost certainly. All the small semiconductors and motherboards that are produced in and around OEMs in and around China. This, again, is a strategic position. But the West has, without thinking, run to get the business from China, never asking the question, has the market, and is the market making a difference to the nature of where China is? And the answer to that is no. In anything, China's going back in the opposite direction, where the rule of law, as we would understand it, and the balance of human rights does simply not exist. So I think we need to review this very carefully. We need to question this. This is not even linked to COVID, but it comes off the back of COVID to recognize that China is now in the situation of being possibly the world's dominant economy. After COVID, it could be that America suffers a big hit. And this could put China in the #1 slot, which is what they have strategically said they want to be. Once they're there as dominant, then they know very well that the free world will really balk at the idea, if we're not careful, of actually questioning some of the business we do with China, because we're so desperate to do the business. And I think this is therefore why we all have to group together in the free world and make a decision about what the limits are of the nature of what business we do with them. And we do also have demands to ask of them when they do, which is that they start changing the nature of the way they govern their people, which is intolerable to many of us. And that strategic drive, by the way, means that they, on the Belt and Road system, where they supply many of the third world with services, etc., all of this makes them very dependent, and they own, I'm told, about 20% of Africa's debt. And part of that is, again, bringing their own kit in. So my longest answer, but the point I make is that critical to the way we recover from this will be the way that we decide we need to treat with China on the way forward. But change has to be the key to that.
It sounds like you believe the West has become dangerously dependent, over-dependent on China economically. And clearly a lot of people talking about China needing to be held to account after this. How else, I mean, you've spoken to some extent about this already. How could the West have a reset with China exactly, in addition to what you've already said?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is all of the free world needs to sit down together and ask this question that I just posed earlier on, which is, how dependent have we become? And what does that mean in terms of our behavior? If you're very dependent on a country like China, then that country has great power to be able to say to you, I'm not prepared to make any changes. So, for example, the treatment of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the Christians in China has been pretty appalling. But when governments talk to China, they always publicly release the fact that they have said to them something stern about this. Really? I suspect the sternness is they raise it as an item, but don't pursue it. And the answer is because you don't want to upset them. And remember what happened when Cameron ended up meeting the Dalai Lama some years ago when he was prime minister. The Chinese said that they were furious with this, and they started threatening and did, in fact, rescind contracts. And so what they then basically did, because we were becoming dependent on them for certain things and we were desperate for business with China, they punished the UK for doing something which they did not approve of because they don't recognize the Dalai Lama at all. And so we ended up pretty much going their direction because he never met him again after that and said he didn't think he needed to. It wasn't because he didn't want to meet him. It's because he was told that if he does, we would suffer a serious financial hit. Now that is what I call dependency. That is power, and we're not alone. Country after country has faced the same. Look at the treatment of Australia when Australia called for an investigation into how COVID broke out in Wuhan. The Chinese, in very undiplomatic terms, referred to dealing with Australia as wiping chewing gum off the base of your shoe. In other words, they threatened Australia that they would cut back. Australia, interestingly, is one of the few countries that has a trade surplus with China. But then the Chinese were threatening them. So my point is, we can't conduct international business if one country can simply go around threatening the others unless they obey what they say. Look at Taiwan. You know, in Taiwan, they have now been locked out of their observer status at the WHO, something that may have had a big impact on getting this virus under control and learning lessons. They have to feed that through China because the present head of the World Health Organization agreed to the one China policy, which meant that therefore, when China said they didn't want Taiwan any longer in, they were taken out. And under the cover of all this, China is definitely cracking down on Hong Kong now, and not one single peep out of any single Western government, because, of course, they're distracted, and that's what China knew. So we do need a serious review. We cannot be this dependent on a country as large and as powerful as China, and whose government simply does not obey the norms of international rules.
And leaving coronavirus and the geopolitics a moment, let's move on to Brexit. How would you characterize the current negotiations? We obviously, our side is led by David Frost, the EU side by Michel Barnier. The negotiations since the coronavirus crisis have been undertaken by video conference. From what we hear in the press, there have been quite significant disagreements between the two sides. What do you think the state of play is right now?
Well, let me just answer that question simply. I think that everything changed in December when we held the election. And I think the EU is playing catch up on that without realizing it. Number one, we are in a much stronger position than we were before. We don't look over our shoulders any longer as a government. We don't have to worry about Parliament. Essentially, the government can get through whatever it needs to get through with regards to Europe for the most part. So that's the first thing. So that has cut out one of the levers that the EU, Monsieur Barnier, used very carefully with those who were opposed to leaving and those who were therefore keen to do whatever they could to hamstring our departure. They've now left the pitch. They're no longer of any great concern. That means basically that when the government decides it wants to do something, that it can get it done internally. Now the EU has to figure out how do you deal with a country that has a significant majority in its government that can actually get stuff through. You can't bully them any longer. So I don't think they've really quite come to terms with that. And I think they won't fully come to terms with that until we cross the June deadline. That deadline where we say we're not going to ask for an extension. I think that's when this whole thing becomes real, because at that stage, the EU will know for certain that there's nothing going to move us on this. That means they have the months remaining till December to complete a trade deal. So that will focus their minds, and I think that is really vital. I think David Frost's recent letter, which you may or may not have seen, in which he explained to the EU, Monsieur Barnier, that he felt that their response to the proposals put forward has been poor, that they haven't engaged in the spirit that it was meant, and that they were asking for things and demanding things which there was no way on earth the British would ever grant them, and particularly in the way that they think that the UK should obey European rules and have the European Court of Justice arbitrate. At the moment, we've got this ridiculous agreement that says in any disputes between us, we have an arbitration procedure, but anything to do with European law will be arbitrated by the European Court of Justice. Well, that is an absurdity. And it puts all the power in the hands of the European Union. So those sort of things that he was referring to are important. It was a very strong letter. It solicited a very short reply from Monsieur Barnier, which appeared when you read it to be a bit of tough talking. In fact, if you read between the lines, I think it tells you everything you need to know about the fact that the European Union is just receiving a real wake-up call on this one, which is that they're not going to be bullied by us. They're not going to come back like they did under Theresa May and ask for another arrangement or give us something and we'll give them back something in return. All of that is gone. You're dealing now with a sovereign partner that demands to be treated as a sovereign nation in all matters and is not going to be bullied into granting fishing rights because otherwise the threat will be no trade deal. If no trade deal is the only thing left on the table, no trade deal is where the UK will be on the 1st of January, and we have no fear of that.
I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but sticking with the transition negotiations, we've heard both from within the UK and within the EU calls for delay. The narrative is that all shoulders to the wheel on the coronavirus crisis. Resources have been stretched, resources have been committed on all sides to this crisis. We've heard calls from within the SNP and the Labour Party to extend the transition. What would you say to those on both sides of the channel who are talking the language of extending transition past 2020?
I think their language is a code for Remain. I don't think it has anything to do with the need to delay. The truth is, we should not delay. We shouldn't even talk about delaying. There is still time, completely enough time to arrange a deal, a trade deal. We're in the situation where really, I think that we just have to get on with it. And the European Union needs to recognize that. As I say, I don't think until we pass the June date, I think minds will not be focused until that point, in which time they know that the choice is no longer delay. The choice is deal or no deal, and that's up to them. And so the ball is back in the European Union's court. If you want a deal, you better tell us how you want to get it, because we're not accepting what you've put on the table now. You have to treat us as a proper sovereign nation with its own laws and to be respected in the same way as you respect, Canada in their trade deal and others. We are not prepared to have special ways in which you think you can weasel your European law into us and control us through the back door.
And perhaps after the coronavirus crisis, in any event, that all bets are off, which may, of course, undermine the Remainers' arguments about the economic hit the UK will take. We hear that the UK is engaging in trade talks with the US, led by Liz Truss on the UK side, Lighthizer on the US side. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are your feelings about that? Your hopes for a UK-US free trade deal, possibly renewed ties with the Commonwealth countries. We hear talk of stronger trade ties with Japan. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are your hopes and aspirations there?
Well, I believe we are doing the right thing. Going to a trade deal with the United States is absolutely right. The intriguing thing about the US, which is why it should be the number one deal that we're after, is that there's nothing that's produced in Europe relevant to the UK that isn't already produced in America. So a deal with America helps literally give us a strong position as we go forward into the negotiations with the EU. So I would encourage the government to accelerate the trade deal with the USA to get it done. There's a lot of silly talk about how this is going to affect farmers and how we're going to see a lessening of our standards. That's simply not true. What we're not going to do is dictate to America how they run their agriculture. But what we do is to say we have certain standards, and those standards can be met in the. Sorry, this has got feedback coming through now at the moment. I've lost you.
That's okay. That will be edited out.
Your picture's gone completely.
Yeah, yours. Don't worry. They will edit this off. So yeah, there we go. We're back on. I think we're fine. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
That's fine. That will be edited.
So should I go back and start that? Do you think?
Yeah, you can if it's easier. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go.
Yeah, it's vital that we get a trade deal moving fast with the United States. There is a proper window to do that before the elections really begin proper in the States, and I think that's really important. We get that done, that hugely helps enormously, both with our deal with Europe and also in accelerating our access to the American markets. There's a little bit of silly talk going on about how this is bad for standards in agriculture. It's complete rubbish. Our standards will always remain high because that's the way that we want them. And we will require others to, when they export to us, like anything else, meet standards that we think are necessary. What we can't go doing is inventing all sorts of different reasons why we can't sell goods. And the point is that, there is real opportunity for our farmers to be selling goods to America. I mean, we just got rid of the beef ban recently, and there's real opportunities for exports of our lamb and our beef and all sorts of areas which the Americans want to consume. So I think this is a two-way process, and we need to get used to the idea that this opens up all markets and improves those markets and gives us greater choice. And that is very much where we are with the States. And the big prize as well is in services, financial services, which are a very, very big deal. The truth is, as we go down the road, I think we'll end up with America, New York and London basically coming together and defining the rules of financial services, global rules, in a way that benefits both of us, because we are both free traders. We are very keen on free markets with the minimum amount of unnecessary regulation. And this, therefore, will be a good thing. This will help get the world moving. And it also means that the European Union looks upon that with real concern, because London is dominant. They need London desperately. 60% of their capital is raised in the London markets. And of all that lovely passporting issue that went on with Europe, everyone said, oh, we need the passports. Actually, 60% of all passports are actually for them to come into London, not for us to go out. So you can see the dominance of London is really important. And with Europe and London together, that really does give us a very secure dominance of the global financial services market. So that's a very important feature of why we need the trade deal with the United States. And I commend Liz Truss for this, because she has stuck to this very doggedly, despite some of the resistance by a very, very small number in government.
There'll be those who...
I couldn't hear you, sorry.
Sorry. You mentioned passporting, Sir Iain. It's interesting you mentioned that. There will be those who are listening to our conversation who would say, the UK is moving away from this huge 500 million strong market right on our doorstep, and there's no way that the trade deal with the US or a trade deal with Japan or closer ties with the Commonwealth can ever compensate. What would you say to those people? And regarding passporting, those people who say that London will lose market share to Frankfurt or to Paris?
Let's deal with the last one first. That is almost a risible comment to say that London will lose market share to Paris and Frankfurt. Paris and Frankfurt are in no position to compete with London. London is, for the most part, a global market. It just happens to be useful that Europe is on its doorstep, because it serves Europe a very big purpose of cheapening capital. And even the head of Frankfurt Financial Services has made the point that there's no way a Frankfurt can replace or even compete with London in that regard, because Frankfurt's financial services needs London to be productive and growing, because they feed off that. So, some people may place some of their links into Frankfurt so that they can access Europe's passporting scheme, unless, of course, the Europeans see common sense in the trade deal that we're having and include financial services in that, then there won't be any need for any problems. But no, the truth is, as I say, 2/3 of all passports are the other way around, Europe coming to London, and therefore it cannot be replaced by France or Frankfurt. And I think Frankfurt's head of financial services, made a very interesting point about a year ago. He said that Frankfurt has, a set number of people involved in financial services, and they obviously want to continue to expand that. But there's no way on earth they can compete with London, which has, close on 1 million people who work in financial services in London. And for him, where they're lucky if they get to 100,000 people, you can see where the big difference is. So no, I don't think we have a fear of competition, because London will win that competition if there was any at all. I think the real point, as we go through into the wider bits of the trade deal, we're not abandoning a market next door to us. What we're saying to that market is we will treat with you and are prepared to treat with you on a free trade basis. That is to say, no tariffs, no artificial regulations. We come under the WTO, but we lodge a free trade deal that gives us good, easy access to each other's markets. Now, it's over to the European Union where they want to lose that. And I do remind everybody that we have a very significant deficit of about, I think it was at last call, £100 billion deficit with the European Union, where they sell more goods than we do to them, including agricultural products and everything else. And we have a surplus in services of about 20 billion, I think. That means an effect around about 80 billion in full deficit to the European Union. So you can do the math yourself, really, as they say in the States. Who suffers most if we end up with tariff barriers? And the answer is the European Union. It's not in their interest. It's not in ours. And I think we need to make that happen. So there's nothing to fear. We now need to get on, embrace free trade with Europe, but also embrace free trade with the rest of the world.
I think of the opportunities for close relations with the Commonwealth, both the Commonwealth realms, Australia and Canada, New Zealand, but also the emerging markets, the emerging giants like India and Nigeria.
Yeah, I didn't really hear that question because you were cutting in and out. I heard Commonwealth and Nigeria, but I didn't hear much else.
Okay, I'll repeat that.
What
do you see the opportunity for closer economic and perhaps geopolitical ties with the Commonwealth countries, both with the Commonwealth realms, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, for instance, but also with market countries, the emerging giants like India and Nigeria?
Well, I think the prospects are very good. I'm a great believer in reinvigorating the Commonwealth as an economic unit. It would be in our benefit to do so. Much and many of those countries and companies in these areas are real growth areas. So, there's real chance for us to get involved. The emerging markets end of things is hugely based in the Commonwealth. And I think, therefore, it's in their interests and ours. We share, for the most part, a common language. Many of their courts operate in exactly the same way as ours. They use common law in the same way that we do. It's, in many sense, easier to do business with them in the Commonwealth and, in this regard, the states, because of the legal base, than it sometimes is to do business with markets in Europe. So all of these are pluses, and I'm very keen for us to get involved with those markets once again and to build them up in a way I think we should have done over the last 40 years, but that's water under the bridge.
The Anglosphere is not some romantic delusion.
No, not at all. I don't really refer to it as the Anglosphere. I just simply say where you have common interests, common bonds, common language, and common legal systems, it means that the only thing left is to decide who wants to buy what from whom and at what rate, because the rest is much easier to sort out. Contract law is much easier, therefore, as a result. All of these things are important. The right to own property is a vital component of a free market. Much of this is observed in many of the Commonwealth countries. So we've got plenty of scope. And, as we look at China and review our dependency on it, we should also be looking at countries like India, full of very, very smart kids coming out of university, real opportunities there to develop that as a market for us as well. So, on a scale very similar to that of China. So, no, I'm positive about the future in that regard.
Back to one could argue that the EU has not recovered its glory during this crisis. We've had the coronavirus, all the southern European countries like hard hit Italy and Spain. looking for common debt issuance in the Eurozone, something which the German and Austrian and the Dutch government have resisted. We're now seeing a little bit of softening in that position. We've had the German Constitutional Court warning the Bundesbank about their participation in Eurozone schemes. And of course, there's a risk of sovereign debt crises springing up across the Eurozone. Can you speak a little bit about that? What are your thoughts about where the EU and the Eurozone are after this crisis?
I think the Eurozone is in quite a lot of trouble at the moment, and I don't take any pleasure in that. But I think the way it's constructed was always bound to end up with a problem. I say that because if you look at the construction of the euro, they have created a currency, but it has no governing body. So in the sense that right now you've got Italy has been borrowing huge sums of money, as have Spain and others, to try and get them through this difficult period. So have we. The difference is that when you create a bond, we would call them gilts here in America, they're called federal bonds. Those bonds have to be backed by your central bank. That means that they are secure in the sense that you know always when push comes to shove, a bank, that central bank, will even print money to safeguard the nature of the bond. So that is the case in the UK. If you buy gilts, you may not earn much money or huge amounts of money off them, but what you will have is a safe haven for your money, which is why, therefore, you can keep interest rates low and money is available to borrow. The problem with borrowing at the moment in Europe is that Barney Reynolds, who's a very esteemed lawyer in financial services here in the UK and others, have pointed out that the euro has a fatal flaw in it, which is that it doesn't actually support this centrally. So as you saw with the recent court case in Germany of the Constitutional Court questioning the right of the European Central Bank to bail countries out or to increase quantitative easing because it was not a national bank. This means basically that calls into question the nature of whether or not the bonds being issued in these countries are really prime bonds, as we would understand them in the UK, gilts, or in America, federal bonds, or are they more second stream bonds, almost subprime in a way, more like American state bonds, which are not backed fully by the federal bank, or here in the UK, there would be bonds that aren't backed fully by the Bank of England. That means basically they are much riskier than a normal national bond would be, which means that therefore, once this begins to become apparent and that there is no mechanism to absolutely guarantee full support for these bonds, because of course, in the UK, if we borrow money, the Bank of England has to be part of that process. Here, it seems the ECB has not been part of this process, and Italy and the other countries have borrowed on their own say-so, and their own cognizance, as it were. And that means now that they face a real challenge. How are they going to deal with this? Because this nature of this means that there are real issues about repayment and debt, and also the amount of debt that is visible on the European Central Bank, because it doesn't sit there forever. It gets pushed to one side and they only see what comes up every year. So we believe that there is a vast amount of money now sitting in debts that is owed by national governments, but which is not underwritten by the European Central Bank, which could lead to serious problems for the European Union and will have to be dealt with. The one way this was protected was by having the euro bond market in London, because London set up around it all sorts of strictures and protections. But once it moves, which is what they want to do, it will go beyond those protections and become evidently very vulnerable. And this does question where they are. And that's why the European Central Bank has been questioned by Germany, because Germany knows at the end of it all, it's going to be Germany that's going to have to bail these things out to add the extra funds. And it's simply disinclined to do so because, just like us, its economy needs all the money it can get. And they don't want to be saddled with having to pay for this. There are other wider issues, too, about the fact that the euro itself seems to break the rules about the nature of currency and currency dumping. If you look at countries like Germany, their currency has been artificially low for a long time now, which has meant that they can export to countries like the States. There's a lot of concern in America that the euro has basically been dumped for countries like that. If they had the Deutschmark still, it would be very high, rather like the yen, which would make it much more difficult for Germany to export, which has allowed them to become quite dominant in these fields, but at the same time also build up a huge sovereign fund, which is not being distributed amongst people. So there are big issues in the European Union, which we will need to deal with as we go forward, and we want them to be sorted out, because the last thing we really want from a market so close to us is for it to fail. And coronavirus is shining a spotlight on its ability to deal with this kind of level of indebtedness.
It's certainly true that the ECB is not a central bank in the central bank of the Federal Reserve. Do you think there is a serious risk, or a risk at all, of sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone?
I do. I think this is becoming apparent, thanks to Barney Reynolds for this incredible piece of work that he's done on this to demonstrate that countries have turned a blind eye to this for some time. But I think what coronavirus does is it begins to shine a very heavy spotlight on the internal failings. Now, the solution to this is either that sovereign nations return to the same state that they were with regards to their currency, which is their central bank backs their currency when it comes to the bond market, or they go in the other direction, which is they centralize all taxation and control, and that the central bank, the ECB, retains the powers and controls to deal with this borrowing. But at the moment, they're betwixt and between, and either way, they need to make a decision.
Certainly. Now, tying all of this together, we've spoken obviously about the coronavirus crisis. We've spoken about the geopolitics with regards to China. We've spoken about the Brexit transition negotiations, and of course the state of the EU. So really, one big prediction, could be economic, could be political, for the next 6 to 12 months, for the rest of 2021, what would that prediction or forecast be?
I think in the early part of this year, running up towards the autumn and maybe beyond in 2020, in economic terms, I think every developed country is going to face serious problems in getting their economies moving. It's going to be for two reasons. One is there are going to be a lot of businesses that simply don't make it through this, even though they've had support. They will crash. You'll see a rise in unemployment, which means much more difficult to get people into work. So these problems will emerge, and the way in which business works will be critical. But I do not think we're going to have a sudden uplift. I may be wrong. I wish I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I feel that at least towards the end of this year, we're going to struggle, and into next year. I am an optimist, though. I believe that the UK economy will pick back up again, because it was in good shape when we went into this. And I think that the underlying structures are still right. I think we have to decide how we're going to deal with our borrowing and indebtedness. I don't think we can go down the road that we went to in 2010, which is a very different game altogether, in some cases worse because of one feature, which is the banks themselves had next to no liquidity. So that caused a real problem for our regrowth, as it were. We don't face that here, so that does hold out some hope. But I do think that we're going to have to think of this more as a wartime debt now, and recognize it's going to be longer to repay it than we might have otherwise done. But that's a matter for to judge. So I do have an optimistic view about the UK economy in the longer term. Having said that, I think the big issues that are coming down the road are what's happening within the Eurozone, which may affect us all. And I do think that the China issue is big. And I note now that I think China's just gone and bought a Norwegian airline. And I think one of the things you're going to see in the features of the economy in the next year or two is that the assets that had once had a particular value will now have a very much lower value. Now, for countries that hold big sovereign funds and that are in the market, this actually becomes an opportunity to buy into those areas, which may be critical to the well-being of a country. And that's why I think it's very important for the government to think very carefully about what they wish to protect in that regard from unhelpful purchase. And as I say, I was told the other day that China is taking a strategic view about buying into a whole series of areas of industry in the developed world as a way of overcoming any resistance to China's products.
Countries like the UK, all the more vital.
I couldn't hear any of that. Sorry.
Sorry, I said that that makes the need for a technological and economic renaissance in the countries like the UK all the more vital.
Indeed, it does. Yeah, and that's why I think we need to plan this now and understand that the most important number one thing is not whacking up taxes and going after businesses for money. The most important thing is to get the businesses back and growing. We need growth, and it will cost us a bit to get that growth, but we need that growth, because when we move away from the support for industry, we need industry to be growing fast, and that way we can get the furloughing schemes down, we can get the special loans down, we can deal with the grants, all that sort of stuff, but only if we get the economy moving and moving fast, and that means taking some risks.
Good, more positive note on which to end. So thank you, Iain Duncan Smith, for your time today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So my thanks to Sir Iain Duncan Smith, and thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Until next time.